The snow fell silent across the Minnesota frontier, but inside the cabins you could hear everything. The crack of frozen timber splitting in the cold, the desperate scrape of shovels pushing ash around stone floors, trying to spread whatever meager warmth remained, the quiet sobs of children whose feet had gone numb, despite being wrapped in every scrap of cloth the family owned. And then there was Henrik Larsen's cabin, where something impossible was happening. While his neighbors huddled within 5 feet of their fireplaces just to survive, Henrik's children played barefoot on his floor. While others burned through cords of firewood every few days, Henrik's fire burned low and steady. While frost climbed the inside walls of every cabin in the settlement, Henrik's walls stayed dry. The difference was 27 degrees, 27 degrees warmer than every other cabin in Pine Bend, Minnesota. 27 degrees that separated comfort from suffering, that turned a brutal winter into something almost pleasant. And the secret wasn't in his walls, wasn't in his fireplace, wasn't in some expensive material shipped from the east. The secret was under his feet, in his floor, the very thing every other settler had built in the simplest, quickest way possible, the thing nobody thought mattered for warmth. Henrik Larsen had built his floor differently, and his neighbors had called him crazy for it. They'd watched him dig when he should have been raising walls. They'd seen him haul stones when he should have been cutting firewood. They'd laughed at the complexity of what he was building, the time he was wasting, the strange ideas he'd brought from the old country. They'd said he'd never finish before winter. They'd said, even if he did, it wouldn't matter. They'd said a floor was just a floor. Then the winter of 1856 to 1857 arrived, and it was a winter that would be remembered for generations. The kind of winter that killed livestock, that drove families out of the territory, that made survivors question whether Minnesota was even habitable. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and stayed there for weeks. Snow fell until it buried first-floor windows. The wind howled day and night without ceasing. And in that winter, Henrik Larsen's crazy floor idea proved to be the difference between life and death, not just for his family, but for everyone who sought shelter in his cabin when their own homes became too cold to survive in. This is the story of how one man's understanding of heat, combined with techniques forgotten by most Americans but preserved in Scandinavian building traditions, created a cabin floor that changed how settlers thought about staying warm. It's about the difference between building fast and building smart, about listening to knowledge from other places, even when everyone around you insists you're wrong. Henrik Larsen was born in 1823 in the Østerdalen Valley of Norway, a place where winter lasted 7 months and temperatures regularly dropped to 30 below. His father was a timber wright, a builder of the substantial log homes that dotted the Norwegian countryside. These weren't the simple cabins of the American frontier. These were sophisticated structures, built with centuries of accumulated knowledge about surviving in extreme cold. From the age of 10, Henrik worked alongside his father, learning not just how to stack logs, but why certain methods worked and others failed. He learned about thermal mass and insulation, about airflow and moisture management. He learned that a house was a system, not just a collection of materials, and that the floor was just as important as the walls or roof, maybe more important because cold air sinks and the ground never stops stealing heat. In Norway, Henrik's father built floors using a method passed down through generations. They called it Grunnvarme, which roughly translates to ground warmth, though the English translation misses the deeper meaning. It wasn't about heating the ground. It was about managing the ground as a thermal element, understanding it as either an enemy that would drain your warmth or an ally that could store and release it. The method involved multiple layers, each serving a specific purpose. A foundation that kept the floor elevated above the frozen earth, a layer of stones that would absorb heat and release it slowly. Channels that would allow air to circulate, carrying warmth from the fire throughout the space beneath the floor, insulating layers that would trap that warmth. And finally, a wooden floor surface that would feel warm to the touch even in the depths of winter. It was complex. It required planning and effort. It added weeks to the building time. But in Norway, where winter could kill you in a night, if your shelter failed, nobody questioned whether it was worth it. The question was only whether you had the skill to build it properly. Henrik immigrated to America in 1853, part of the wave of Scandinavian settlers drawn to the Minnesota Territory by promises of land and opportunity. He worked for 2 years in a lumber mill near St. Paul, saving money and learning about American building methods. What he learned troubled him. American settlers built fast. They had to. The Homestead Act and similar land policies required structures to be built quickly to prove claims. Labor was expensive and scarce. Materials had to be harvested and processed by hand. The result was a building philosophy that prioritized speed and simplicity over everything else. The typical Minnesota cabin floor was brutally simple. If you were lucky and had time, you'd lay down a floor of split logs, called puncheons, directly on the ground. The logs were simply split in half and laid flat side up. No foundation, no elevation, no insulation, just wood touching frozen earth. If you were in a hurry or lacked tools, you might just have a packed dirt floor. Henrik saw these cabins and understood immediately what would happen in a real winter. The ground would freeze solid, sometimes to a depth of 4 feet or more. That frozen ground would act like a massive heat sink, constantly drawing warmth out of the cabin. The floor would be ice cold. Anyone sitting or sleeping near it would lose body heat through conduction. The cold air, being denser, would pool at floor level, creating a layer of frigid air that no amount of fire could adequately warm. He tried to explain this to other settlers, but they didn't want to hear it. They'd survived previous winters in these simple cabins. Sure, it was cold, but that's just how winter was. You lived close to the fire, you wore heavy clothes indoors, you accepted discomfort as the price of frontier life. Henrik's talk of thermal mass and heat circulation sounded like foreign nonsense, overcomplicating something that didn't need to be complicated. When Henrik filed his own claim in 1855 on land near Pine Bend, about 30 miles south of St. Paul, he made a decision. He would build his cabin the right way, the Norwegian way, even if it took longer, even if people mocked him, even if it seemed excessive by American standards. He'd lived through Norwegian winters. He knew what real cold could do, and he knew that Minnesota, at the same latitude as Oslo, could deliver that same killing cold. The site he selected told the story of his thinking. Most settlers chose flat, open land, easy to clear and plow. Henrik chose a south-facing slope with a slight rise to the north. The slope would provide natural drainage, keeping moisture away from his foundation. The rise would block the worst of the north wind, and the southern exposure would catch maximum sunlight, warming the ground around his cabin, even in winter. He began work in April of 1855, as soon as the ground thawed enough to dig, and dig he did. While his neighbors were felling trees and raising walls, Henrik was excavating. He dug down 2 feet across the entire footprint of his cabin, which measured 20 feet by 16 feet. Then he dug deeper in specific areas, creating channels and spaces for his floor system. His nearest neighbor, a man named Jacob Morrison from Pennsylvania, stopped by to watch. Morrison had built his own cabin in 3 weeks the previous summer and considered himself an experienced frontiersman. "You building a cabin or a root cellar?" Morrison asked, watching Henrik shovel. "A cabin," Henrik replied, not pausing in his work. "Seems like you're starting mighty deep just for a floor." "The floor is the foundation of warmth. Build it wrong, and nothing else matters." Morrison shook his head. "Floor is just there to keep you off the dirt. Don't need to dig to China for that. you're wasting good building time." "Perhaps," Henrik said, "or perhaps I'm investing it." Word spread through the small settlement. The Norwegian fellow was digging a hole instead of building a cabin. He'd never be ready for winter. Some folks felt sorry for him. Others figured he'd learned the hard way that American methods were faster and just as good. A few thought he was simple-minded, unable to adapt to frontier practicality. Henrik ignored them and kept working. Once the excavation was complete, he began laying stone. He'd been collecting stones since the snow melted, gathering them from his land, from the creek, from anywhere he could find them. Flat stones, round stones, stones of every size. His neighbors thought this was another waste of time. Why collect stones when you should be cutting logs? If you're enjoying this deep dive into forgotten building wisdom that kept our ancestors alive, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We uncover these lost techniques every week, knowledge that's more relevant now than ever. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out. The stone layer was critical to Henrik's design. He laid stones across the entire excavated area, creating a level surface about 18 inches below the eventual floor level. This wasn't random. The stones served multiple purposes. They were thermal mass, capable of absorbing and storing heat. They were a drainage layer, allowing any moisture to escape downward away from the wood, and they created a stable, level base for everything that would come above. But Henrik didn't stop there. He built something his neighbors had never seen. In the excavated channels, he constructed a network of stone-lined passages, each about 8 inches wide and 10 inches tall. These passages connected to each other and led to openings at the edges of the foundation. It looked like an underground maze, and nobody could figure out what it was for. "What in blazes are those tunnels for?" Morrison asked on one of his visits. "For air to move," Henrik said. "Air. What's air got to do with staying warm? Everything. Warm air must circulate. If it sits still, you waste it. If it moves properly, it spreads the heat where you need it." Morrison thought this was the craziest thing yet. Everyone knew hot air rose. That's why you built a tall cabin with a loft, so the hot air would rise and warm the upper sleeping area. What was the point of moving air under the floor? Henrik tried to explain. The fireplace would be built at one end of the cabin. Normally, all its heat would radiate upward and outward, with most of it escaping up the chimney or warming only the area immediately around it. But if you could capture some of that heat and channel it beneath the floor, spreading it across the entire floor surface, you could turn your floor from a heat sink into a heat source. Instead of cold rising from below, warmth would radiate upward. Morrison didn't understand it, and he didn't try very hard. It seemed like a complicated solution to a problem that didn't exist. Just build a good fire and stay close to it. That's what everyone did. As spring turned to summer, Henrik's cabin slowly took shape. The stonework was complete by June. Above the stones and channels, he built the actual foundation, using large timbers set on stone piers to create an elevated platform. The space between the ground-level stones and the elevated floor platform was about 14 inches. This created a crawl space where his air channels could function. Then came the insulation layer. Henrik mixed clay from the creek with dried grass and spread it several inches thick across the stone layer, everywhere except in his air channels. Once dry, this created a barrier that would prevent moisture from rising while still allowing his channels to function. Above this, he laid a subfloor of rough split logs, running perpendicular to the direction his final floor would run. These were fitted tightly together, but not sealed. Small gaps remained between them. Again, his neighbors wondered why. "If you're building a floor, shouldn't it be sealed tight?" Henrik explained to anyone who would listen. The gaps allowed air to move up from the channels, spreading warmth across the floor surface. But the gaps were small enough that you wouldn't feel a draft, and the final floor layer above would cover them anyway. It was about circulation, not sealing everything tight. In the space above his subfloor, but below where his final floor would go, Henrik added another innovation that seemed wasteful to his neighbors. He spread a 6-inch layer of dry sand. Sand? Indoors? That made no sense. Sand belonged outside, in roads and riverbanks, not in a house. But Henrik knew that dry sand was an excellent insulator. The tiny air pockets between sand grains trapped heat, just like the air pockets in wool or fur. And sand had another property. It was a moisture buffer. If any dampness did manage to rise from below, the sand would absorb it without rotting like wood would. And in summer, the sand would stay cool, helping keep the cabin comfortable in heat. The final floor layer went down in August. These were carefully fitted planks, smoothed and tight-jointed. Henrik planed each board himself, fitting them so precisely that you could barely see the seams. This surface would be what his family walked on, what they felt with their bare feet, what they sat and slept near. It needed to be as perfect as he could make it. But the floor system wasn't complete. The real innovation came with how Henrik connected his floor to his fireplace. He built his fireplace not against the outer wall like most settlers did, but set in from the wall by about 3 feet. The fireplace itself was massive, built from stones mortared together with a firebox large enough to take logs 4 feet long. But at the base of the fireplace, at floor level, Henrik built something unique. Stone channels that led from the fireplace base into his underfloor air passages. These channels had adjustable stone dampers that could be opened or closed. When open, they allowed hot air from the fire to flow into the underfloor space. The hot air would circulate through the channels, warming the stone layer and the sand layer and the floor surface above, before eventually escaping through vents at the far end of the cabin. It was, in essence, a simplified form of the hypocaust system the Romans had used 2,000 years earlier, adapted for a frontier cabin. Warm air from the fire was being used twice. First to heat the living space directly, and second to heat the floor mass, which would radiate warmth back upward and hold that warmth for hours after the fire died down. When Henrik explained this to Morrison, the American settler just laughed. "You've built a cabin with a furnace under the floor. That's the most complicated, wasteful thing I've ever seen. How long's that going to take to heat up? How much wood's it going to burn? You've made a cold problem into a complicated problem." Henrik just smiled. "We'll see," he said. The cabin was completed in early September of 1855. Henrik had been working on it for 5 months, far longer than the 3 or 4 weeks most cabins took. The walls were good, solid logs, well chinked. The roof was stout with multiple layers. But the real work, the real innovation, was in that floor. Nobody could see it now that it was finished, but Henrik knew it was there. The stone mass, the air channels, the insulation layers, the careful construction, all invisible, all dismissed as crazy by his neighbors. The first test came in November. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there. The first snow fell. Settlers began spending more time indoors, firing up their fireplaces, burning through their firewood stocks. Henrik built his first fire in his new fireplace, using the dampers to control how much hot air flowed into his underfloor channels. At first, nothing seemed different. The cabin warmed just like any cabin with a good fire. But then, after about 2 hours, something unusual started happening. The floor began to feel warm. Not hot, not uncomfortably warm, but noticeably warm to the touch. His wife Ingrid, who'd been skeptical of all Henrik's extra work, placed her hand on the floorboards and looked up in surprise. "It's warm," she said. "The floor is warm." Their 3 children, who'd been playing near the fireplace, as children always did, started moving around the cabin. Usually, moving away from the fire meant moving into cold. But now the floor everywhere in the cabin was comfortably warm. The children lay down on it, playing with their wooden toys in the middle of the room, far from the fire, perfectly comfortable. Henrik let the fire burn down to coals. Normally, this was when cold would start creeping back into a cabin, But in Henrik's cabin, the floor stayed warm. The stone mass beneath it had absorbed heat. The sand layer was holding warmth. The wooden floor surface was radiating that warmth upward. The temperature in the cabin dropped only slightly. Before bed, Henrik closed the dampers to his floor channels, conserving what heat remained in the mass below. Through the night, as the fire died completely to ash, that heat slowly released upward. When the family woke in the morning, the cabin was still comfortable. Not as warm as it had been the evening before, but far warmer than a typical cabin would be with a dead fire. Morrison stopped by the next day. "Heard your floor's doing something strange," he said. "It's warm," Henrik replied. "Come in and feel." Morrison stepped inside, removed his boots as courtesy required, and immediately felt the warmth through his stockings. He walked around the cabin, testing different spots. Everywhere the floor was noticeably warm. Meanwhile, Morrison knew his own cabin's floor was ice cold unless you were within a few feet of the fire. "How?" Morrison asked. "How's it staying warm?" Henrik explained the system again. The thermal mass absorbing heat, the air channels distributing it, the insulation holding it, the floor becoming not just a surface to walk on, but a heater in its own right. "How much wood are you burning?" Morrison asked. "Less than you, I think," Henrik said. "The heat isn't escaping up the chimney or through the walls as quickly. It's being stored in the floor, released slowly." Morrison left, impressed but uncertain. It was one thing for a floor to be warm in November. The real test would be January and February, when the true cold arrived. That test came in the winter of 1856 to 1857, and it was a test that would be remembered as one of the worst winters in Minnesota history. The cold arrived early and stayed late. By December, temperatures were regularly dropping to 30 below zero. By January, 40 below became common. The cold was relentless, brutal, the kind of cold that made seasoned frontiersmen question their choices. Snow fell in quantities that buried cabins to their roof lines. Drifts 20 feet high blocked trails. Travel became impossible. Supply wagons couldn't get through. Families were isolated, dependent entirely on what they'd prepared before winter arrived. And in that winter, the difference between Henrik's cabin and everyone else's became a matter of survival. Morrison's cabin, typical of the settlement, had a floor that was basically useless for warmth. The split log puncheons laid directly on the ground had frozen solid. Frost crept up through the gaps between logs. The floor was so cold that Morrison's family couldn't sit on it or walk on it barefoot, even for a moment. They spent their days and nights huddled within a few feet of the fireplace, the only place that was even marginally warm. Morrison burned 4 cords of wood in January alone, feeding his fire constantly just to maintain survivable temperatures. His family wore every piece of clothing they owned indoors. The children's hands and feet showed signs of frostbite despite being inside. And still, the cold crept in. The walls, the roof, but especially the floor radiated cold upward. It was like trying to heat a space while standing on a block of ice. Other families in the settlement faced similar struggles. One family, the Andersons, abandoned their cabin entirely after their youngest child developed severe frostbite. They moved in with relatives in town, giving up on their claim rather than risk death. 2 elderly settlers died that winter, found frozen in their cabins when neighbors checked on them. The cold had simply been too much. Henrik's cabin existed in a different reality. On a day when the outside temperature hit 42 below zero, the temperature inside Henrik's cabin was a comfortable 65 degrees. 65 degrees. Warm enough to be in shirt sleeves. Warm enough for children to play comfortably anywhere in the cabin. Warm enough to sleep without piling on every blanket they owned. The difference was 27 degrees. 27 degrees warmer than Morrison's cabin just a quarter mile away. 27 degrees created by that crazy floor system that nobody had believed would matter. Henrik's floor had become a massive thermal battery. Every day, He'd build up a good fire for a few hours, opening the dampers to send hot air through the underfloor channels. The stone layer, hundreds of pounds of rock, would absorb that heat. The sand layer would trap it. The wooden floor surface would conduct it upward. Then he'd close the dampers and let the fire die down to coals. Through the afternoon and evening, the floor would release that stored heat, slowly, steadily, turning the entire floor surface into a gentle radiator. By morning, the floor had cooled somewhat, but was still noticeably warm. A few hours of fire and it would be fully recharged. Henrik burned less than half the firewood Morrison did. The thermal mass system meant heat wasn't escaping as quickly. It was being captured, stored, and released efficiently. Henrik could actually let his fire go out at night, something Morrison would never dare do. The stored heat in the floor mass was enough to keep the cabin comfortable until morning. The difference in daily life was profound. In Morrison's cabin, life contracted to the immediate vicinity of the fireplace. You couldn't work on projects, couldn't move around comfortably, couldn't sleep well. The children were miserable, confined to a tiny warm zone in a cold room. In Henrik's cabin, the entire space was livable. Ingrid could work at her table in the center of the room. The children could play anywhere. Henrik could work on tools and equipment without his hands going numb. The family could sleep in an actual bed against the wall, not huddled in a pile near the fire. It was the difference between surviving and living, between enduring winter and being comfortable during it, between questioning whether you could make it through another month and knowing you'd be fine. The story of Henrik's warm floor spread through the settlement, though at first people were isolated enough that news traveled slowly. It was Morrison who really spread the word. In late January, during a brief warming period that allowed some travel, Morrison made his way to Henrik's cabin to see how they were doing. When Henrik opened the door, warm air flowed out. Real warmth, the kind Morrison hadn't felt in his own cabin in months. Morrison stepped inside and almost cried. After weeks of constant cold, the warmth was overwhelming. "Lord above," Morrison said. "It's like a house back east. It's actually warm." Henrik's children were playing in the middle of the floor, barefoot, wearing light clothes. Ingrid was working at her table without a shawl. Henrik himself was in a simple shirt, no coat or layers needed. "Your floor," Morrison said, placing his hand on it. "It's warm. No, it's more than warm. It's like it's alive, like it's generating heat." "It's storing it," Henrik corrected. "The fire heats the stone and sand underneath. They release it slowly. The floor becomes a heater itself." Morrison walked around, testing the floor in different spots. Everywhere, noticeably warm. Not scalding, not uncomfortable, just perfectly warm. He thought about his own cabin, where the floor was a zone of misery, where cold radiated up through his feet no matter how many socks he wore. "Well, how much wood are you burning?" Morrison asked, though he suspected the answer. "Maybe a cord and a half this month," Henrik said. "A cord and a half?" Morrison was stunned. "I've burned 4 cords. 4 cords, and my cabin's barely livable. You've burned a third of what I have, and your cabin's comfortable." The mathematics of it hit Morrison hard. He'd spent weeks this winter cutting firewood in brutal, cold, dangerous work that had nearly killed him twice. Henrik had spent his time indoors, comfortable, burning through his wood supply at a fraction of Morrison's rate. "All because of the floor," Morrison said quietly. "The floor, the stone mass, the air circulation?" Henrik agreed. "It's a system. Each part supports the others." Morrison sat down at Henrik's table, and for a moment he was quiet. Then he said, "I called you crazy. When you were digging and hauling stones, when you were building all those tunnels under your floor, I told people you didn't understand frontier building. I said you were overcomplicating things." "I remember," Henrik said without judgment. "I was wrong. Dead wrong. And my family's paying the price for my stubbornness. My children have frostbite. My wife hasn't been warm in weeks. And you're all here, comfortable as if it's spring." Henrik poured Morrison some hot coffee from the pot. that sat warming near the fire. You built what you knew how to build. That's all any of us can do. But you knew better. You tried to tell me, and I didn't listen. You listened to what your experience had taught you. American cabins had worked well enough in the winters you'd seen. You had no reason to believe they wouldn't work in this winter. Except you knew, Morrison insisted. You'd seen worse winters. You knew this could happen. I'd seen Norwegian winters, dear, Henrik agreed. And yes, I knew Minnesota could deliver the same. That's why I built the way I did. Morrison finished his coffee in the warm cabin, dreading the return to his own cold house. Before he left, he asked, "Could you help me? This spring, could you help me rebuild my floor, or at least improve it?" "Of course," Henrik said. "When the ground thaws, we'll dig. It's too late for this winter, but next winter your floor can be warm too." Morrison returned to his cabin and his suffering family. But now he had something he hadn't had before: hope. The knowledge that it didn't have to be this way, that there was a better method, a proven system that could transform winter from something to survive into something merely to endure with comfort. He told everyone he met about Henrik's floor, how warm it was, how much less wood Henrik burned, how the Norwegians' crazy ideas had created the only comfortable cabin in the settlement. February brought the worst of the winter. A blizzard hit that lasted 4 days straight. Snow piled so high against cabin walls that some settlers were trapped inside, unable to open their doors. The temperature during the blizzard hovered around 45 below zero, with wind that made the effective temperature far worse. It was during this blizzard that Henrik's cabin became a refuge for more than just his family. On the second day of the storm, there was a desperate knocking at Henrik's door. He opened it to find the Peterson family, 3 adults and 2 children, nearly frozen. They'd tried to weather the storm in their own cabin a mile away, but their fireplace had been blocked by snow coming down the chimney. Without heat, their cabin had become a death trap. They'd made the dangerous journey through waist-deep snow to reach Henrik's cabin, drawn by the knowledge that there was one place in the settlement that was reliably warm. Henrik pulled them all inside. The contrast was immediate and dramatic, from life-threatening cold to genuine warmth in the space of stepping through a doorway. The Peterson children were crying from the cold and fear. Within 10 minutes of sitting on Henrik's warm floor, they'd calmed down. Within an hour, they were playing with Henrik's children as if nothing had happened. The Petersons stayed for 3 days until the blizzard passed, and Henrik could help them clear their chimney. During those 3 days, Henrik's cabin housed 10 people comfortably. 10 people in a 20 by 16-foot space should have been cramped and miserable. But the warmth made it bearable. More than bearable. The floor's even warmth meant people could spread out across the entire cabin. Children could sleep on the floor itself, comfortable and warm. Mrs. Peterson cried when it was time to leave, not from sadness, but from the realization of what she was returning to. Her cabin with its frozen floor, its constant cold, its desperate huddling near a smoky fire. She asked Henrik the same question Morrison had asked. Could he help them improve their floor come spring? He agreed, of course. And he knew that by spring he'd likely have more requests than he could possibly fulfill. The winter finally broke in late March of 1857. The temperature rose above freezing for the first time in what felt like years. Snow began to melt. The settlement took stock of what the winter had cost them. 2 dead. 3 families abandoned their claims and left the territory. Multiple cases of serious frostbite. Livestock losses were severe. It had been a winter that tested everyone and broke many. But Henrik's family had come through without any serious hardship. They'd been comfortable throughout. The children were healthy. The adults were rested, not worn down by constant cold. They'd even used less of their food stores because being warm meant their bodies didn't have to burn as many calories maintaining body temperature. As news of Henrik's warm floor spread beyond Pine Bend, it became something of a legend. That Norwegian settler who'd built a heated floor while everyone laughed at him. the crazy idea that had turned out to be genius. The cabin that had stayed 27 degrees warmer while others froze. Settlers began arriving at Henrik's cabin in April and May, asking to see his floor system. Henrik would take them outside and show them the vents where warm air could escape. He'd take them into his crawl space and show them the stone channels, now visible in the light of spring. He'd explain the principles: thermal mass, insulation, air circulation, heat storage, and release. Some visitors understood immediately. Others struggled with concepts that seemed foreign, but everyone could understand the result. A warm floor that held heat for hours, a cabin that needed half the firewood, a winter that was comfortable instead of miserable. True to his word, Morrison was the first to request Henrik's help in improving his floor. In June of 1857, they began the work. They couldn't fully recreate Henrik's system without tearing down the entire cabin, but they could improve what was there. They jacked up the cabin and installed a foundation that elevated the floor 18 inches off the ground. They laid a stone layer in the space beneath, creating some thermal mass. They installed a simple channel system, not as elaborate as Henrik's, but functional. They added sand insulation and a proper floor surface. And they connected it to Morrison's fireplace with a small channel that could direct some hot air into the underfloor space. The work took 3 weeks, far longer than Morrison had spent building his original cabin. But when they were done and tested the system the following winter, the difference was remarkable. Morrison's cabin wasn't as warm as Henrik's. The system was simpler, less efficient. But it was vastly better than what he'd had before. His floor was warm instead of frozen. His family could move around the cabin comfortably. His firewood consumption dropped by more than half. "I should have listened to you from the start," Morrison told Henrik. "Would have saved me a winter of suffering." "You listened when it mattered," Henrik replied. "That's what counts." Over the next several years, Henrik helped more than 20 families in the Pine Bend area improve their cabin floors. Some built full systems like his. Others built simplified versions. A few just added elevation and basic insulation, which alone made a significant difference. The specific implementation varied, but the principle remained the same. The floor wasn't just a surface to walk on. It was a thermal element, and if designed properly, it could transform a cabin from barely survivable to genuinely comfortable. The techniques spread beyond Pine Bend as well. Settlers Henrik had helped would move to new areas and build with these principles. They'd tell others about the Norwegian's floor system. Those others would tell more people. By the 1860s, throughout Minnesota and parts of Wisconsin and the Dakotas, you could find cabins built with some version of Henrik's approach. The knowledge was adapted to different circumstances. In areas where stone was scarce, builders used clay or adobe bricks for thermal mass. In places where digging was difficult due to rocky soil, they elevated floors higher and used thicker sand insulation without the underground channels. In regions with milder winters, they simplified the system, keeping just the elements that gave the most benefit for the least effort. But the core insight remained: managing the floor as a thermal element, using mass to store heat, using insulation to retain it, turning what had been a source of heat loss into a source of warmth. If you're fascinated by these ingenious survival techniques from the past and want to learn more skills that could make a real difference, hit that subscribe button now. We're building a community of people who understand that old knowledge might be more valuable than new technology. Modern building science would eventually explain exactly why Henrik's floor system worked so well. The stone layer provided thermal mass with high specific heat capacity, meaning it could absorb significant amounts of heat energy without its temperature rising too dramatically. This heat would then release slowly as the surrounding air cooled, stabilizing the temperature. The sand layer provided insulation through trapped air between grains, while also serving as a moisture buffer. The air channels created convection currents that distributed heat evenly across the floor surface. The multiple layers created multiple interfaces where heat transfer was slowed, preventing the rapid heat loss that plagued simple floors. The elevated foundation prevented ground coupling, the direct conduction of heat into frozen earth. And the system as a whole turned the floor into a low-temperature radiant heater, which modern research shows is one of the most efficient and comfortable forms of heating because it warms surfaces and objects rather than just air. Henrik's system, designed through empirical knowledge and traditional practice, had incorporated principles that wouldn't be formally studied and understood until decades later. He didn't know the physics equations, but he understood the reality. Heat stored in mass is heat available later. Air that can circulate spreads warmth more efficiently. Insulation that prevents loss is as important as the heat source itself. These principles had been known in various forms throughout history. The Romans had used hypocaust systems with underfloor heating in their bathhouses and villas. Korean ondol floors had used similar principles for centuries. Northern European building traditions had long understood thermal mass and insulation. Henrik wasn't inventing something new. He was adapting old knowledge to a new context, translating Norwegian building wisdom into something that worked for American frontier conditions. The tragedy was how much of this knowledge had been lost or dismissed in America's rush westward. Settlers building fast and cheap ignored principles that could have made their lives dramatically better. They suffered through winters that didn't need to be as brutal. They burned through forests cutting firewood that better design could have saved. They accepted discomfort as inevitable when it was actually avoidable. Henrik's willingness to build slowly and properly, to trust old country wisdom over frontier expediency, to ignore mockery and build for performance rather than speed. That willingness saved not just his family, but everyone who learned from his example. The cabin Henrik built in 1855 stood for over 60 years. Multiple families lived in it over that time. Everyone who did remarked on the same thing. The floor stayed warm. Even in the coldest weather, even with minimal fire, the floor was always noticeably warm. The cabin was finally torn down in 1918 to make room for a larger farmhouse. But when it was disassembled, the builders examined the floor system with amazement. The stone layer was still there, still functional. The sand was still dry. The channels were still clear. The system had required almost no maintenance over 6 decades of use. The quality of the original construction had been so good that it had simply continued working year after year, winter after winter. Some of the stones from Henrik's floor were saved and reused in the foundation of the new house. A section of the air channel was preserved and is now in the collection of the Minnesota Historical Society. And the story of Henrik's floor became part of local history, told and retold as an example of immigrant innovation and the value of traditional knowledge. Henrik Larsen himself lived to the age of 79, dying in 1902. He had a successful life as a farmer and builder, raised 6 children who all survived to adulthood, which was remarkable for that era, and became a respected member of his community. But he was always known primarily as the man who built the warm floor cabin. In his later years, Henrik was interviewed several times by people interested in pioneer history. He always emphasized the same points. Building properly takes time, but saves time in the end. Knowledge from other places and other times is valuable, even when it seems strange or excessive. Comfort isn't a luxury. It's a foundation for health, productivity, and quality of life. In one interview conducted when he was 72, Henrik reflected on that first winter in his new cabin, the winter of 1856 to 57, when the temperature hit 42 below, and his floor stayed warm while others froze. "If people thought I was crazy, he said. Thought I was wasting time digging and hauling stones, but that time I spent in the warm months saved me hundreds of hours of cutting extra firewood in the cold. More than that, it saved me from suffering. My children didn't get frostbite. My wife didn't spend the winter in misery. We were comfortable. That comfort was worth every hour I spent building properly. The interviewer asked if he'd ever doubted his approach when neighbors were mocking him. Never, Henrik said. I'd lived through Norwegian winters. I knew what cold could do, and I knew that Americans, for all their frontier toughness, didn't really understand cold yet. They'd had some mild winters and thought they knew what winter was, but I knew winters could be worse, much worse. So I built for the worst I could imagine. And when that worst came, I was ready. The lesson from Henrik Larsen's floor extends far beyond cabin building. It's about the value of deep knowledge over quick solutions, about trusting expertise even when it comes from unexpected sources, about taking the time to do things properly instead of rushing to do them quickly, about understanding systems rather than just assembling components. In our modern world, we've largely forgotten these lessons. We build fast, value convenience over durability, prioritize initial cost over long-term performance. We've forgotten that the cheapest option is rarely the best option. That complexity can be valuable when it serves a purpose. That traditional knowledge often contains wisdom that modern shortcuts ignore. The homeowners today who spend winters struggling with cold floors, who burn through expensive energy trying to heat poorly designed spaces, who suffer discomfort in their own homes. They're repeating the mistakes of those 1850s settlers who built fast and simple and paid the price in suffering. Meanwhile, the few who build with attention to thermal mass, to insulation systems, to proper foundation design, to radiant floor heating, they're rediscovering what Henrik knew, that a properly designed floor can transform a building's performance. That heat stored is heat available later. That comfort is built in, not added on. The specific techniques may differ. We use concrete instead of stone, closed cell foam instead of sand, hydronic loops instead of air channels. But the principles remain identical. Manage the floor as a thermal element. Use mass to store heat. Use insulation to retain it. Design for the system, not just the components. Henrik's crazy floor idea that held his cabin 27 degrees warmer was only crazy to people who didn't understand heat, who didn't value comfort, who thought frontier life had to mean suffering. To anyone who understood building as a craft rather than a chore, who valued performance over speed, who thought about next winter while building in summer, Henrik's floor was obvious brilliance. The cabin is gone now. The man who built it has been dead for over a century. But the lesson remains, carved not in stone, but in the memory of those 27 degrees. The difference between struggling and thriving, between enduring and enjoying, between building fast and building right. When settlers mocked Henrik's crazy floor idea, they were mocking their own future comfort. When Henrik ignored them and kept digging, kept hauling stones, kept building his complex system of channels and layers, he was investing in warmth that would last decades. The mockery lasted a season. The warmth lasted a lifetime. That's the final lesson. The critics are always loud in the moment. They're always certain you're wrong. They're always focused on speed and simplicity and doing things the way they've always been done. But when winter comes, when the test arrives, when comfortable meets miserable, the truth reveals itself. Henrik Larsen's floor was warm, his family was comfortable, his cabin became a refuge, and his crazy idea became the standard everyone wished they'd followed. 27 degrees. That's not just a temperature difference, it's the gap between wisdom and ignorance, between preparation and regret, between building for how things are and building for how things could be. Henrik chose wisely. He built the floor that stayed warm, and for that choice, made in the face of mockery and doubt, he and his family enjoyed comfort, while others suffered. The floor was warm. The family was safe. The crazy man was right. That's the story. That's the lesson. That's what one settler's floor idea proved when winter came and tested everyone's choices. Some choices keep you alive. Some keep you comfortable. Henrik Larsen's floor did both, and that made all the difference.